The next interview question that we're going to talk about is local versus global variables. And this is one of those topics that you can go into in great depth. I just want to touch the surface here of what they are. So let's start off with, if I define a variable, if I say here x equals a, b, c, d, e. So I've now defined a variable. Fine, I've defined the variable x, and its value is a, b, c, d, e. So far, so good. What kind of variable is this? It's actually a global variable. How do I know it's a global variable? Well, it's actually pretty easy. If it's defined outside of a function, it's a global variable, which means if I say here, for I in range 5, right, we can say here, y equals I times 10. Many people believe that because this assignment here to y only takes place inside of an indented block, and because y wasn't defined previously, then when I execute this code, well then y doesn't exist globally. But that's not true. Y does exist globally because we haven't created a function, no local variable. Meaning, if we're not in a function, we definitely have a global variable. Okay, well that means then what about I? Yeah, I also is a global variable. When we defined I in our for loop, we got a global variable there. So there you go. But what happens when we go into a function? What happens when we define a function? If I say here def, double. Let's start off with def 5. All right, let's say here x equals 5. Okay, so I'm going to execute this function now. I'm just going to do 5. Okay, and what's the value of x now? Actually, the value of x remains a, b, c, d, e. But wait a second, didn't I just run the function? And doesn't the function define x to be 5? Yes, it does. But this x and the x I defined above are completely different variables. This x, this is a new variable x, right, local to the function. Meaning that outside of the function, this x doesn't exist, it isn't defined, it certainly doesn't have the value that we gave it. And if I were to have a separate variable, different variable, if I said, def whatever, I say a equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now if I run whatever, so far so good, what's the value of a? Actually, a doesn't even exist. A only existed locally. So variables that you create within functions are local variables. Variables that you create outside of functions are global variables. Okay, what about parameters? What if I say here def hello name, and then we'll say return f string of hello name. What is name? Well, I say hello world. So it works just fine. Name, though, is a local variable, but it's a special kind of local variable, right? Name is a parameter. Local variable, but it gets its value from whoever calls the function. It doesn't have a value defined inside of the function, meaning we must pass a value along when we invoke the function. Now this means then that when you're inside of a function, if you define a variable or assign to a variable with the same name as you have outside, just as we saw here, you don't affect the outside variable. Now I don't want to go into here all the nuances of how this happens and so forth, but if you really want to, I can do this. I can say here def 5, and now I'm going to say global x, meaning don't create a local variable x. So now I run the 5 function, it assigned to x, and now the value of x, the global variable x, is 5. Meaning when I defined my function 5, I told it don't create a local variable x. So when it assigns to x, if there's no local, what is it going to go to? Global. The distinction between local and global variables is actually pretty important, and it leads to a whole topic of scoping called LEGB, how Python looks for variables in its scoping. And we'll touch on that later in this course as well. But in the biggest, most general sense, local variables defined inside functions don't exist outside of functions. Global variables exist outside of functions and typically can't be modified from within a function, at least can't be assigned to from within a function unless you use the global keyword.